Although Praxiteles himself at 28 lay dead, for sculpture isn't for young men, as Constantin Brancusi at a later hour said.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the program. The poet that you saw was the great Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and the young man who looks like my grandson was me back in 1994 when we recorded part of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's vast body of work. This was from his wonderful poem, Pictures of the Gone World, and we're so glad that we can celebrate Lawrence in addition to having our wonderful, wonderful guests, Mr. Bill Morgan, who's written so many books that none of us can keep up with him, and worked with Lawrence Ferlinghetti for almost 50 years. And he can tell you how he first met him. And he has such a good story. I won't spoil that. And returning, in addition to our special guest, is the fabulous Mr. Jim Canary, who's the keeper of the scroll, the original scroll of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and wonderful visual artist who can make such beautiful paintings on the spot relating to what we're doing. And we're so glad that he could be here, Mr. Norton Wisdom. And of course, our two young, brilliant producers, Pamela Dickerson and the fabulous Mr. Anthony de Merbier. So we're going to begin by reading where we left off last week when Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, and I were giving a spontaneous poetry reading, unsolicited, to Buddy the Wino, a great connoisseur of fine wines at reasonable prices, and his friend Rocco, who was a retired Army veteran who decided rather than getting a regular job, he continue his outdoor activities outside of the barracks by living on the street, and was someone that was beloved in Greenwich Village as well as a great source. So I'm putting on my reading glasses and so happy all of you could come and join us for this special program that we're so delighted and honored to be doing. Jack was the most generous of all of us and always promoted others to be in the spotlight. But because we were only 6 of us in the room, he read for half an hour, poem after poem, in a great series that we know now as the Mexico City Blues, until the scroll, which he wrote it on, was nearly completely rolled up. He also read others from small notebooks. I played whatever came to me that the poem suggested, as I always have done. All the images and all the stories that fill the pages of Jack's poetry and prose make you think of more musical ideas than you could ever have time to use in a lifetime. It was more intense with the 6 of us in the room than it would have been playing for a large group of people. We were creating something just for the 6 of us. We all sat in silence after Jack's reading was done. "Brother Jack, you're something else," said Buddy. "You took me right out there with you." "You nailed it, Jack," said Rocco. "You took us all down to Mexico." "This must be published," said Allen. "I'm going to make some calls." "I'm late for my date, but it's worth missing my new true love to hear that, Jack," said Gregory. "You're a true poet." I was speechless after hearing as well as playing for Jack's Orlando Orizaba 210 Blues and Mexico City Blues. This was the first time I even knew the names of what Jack was reading. I never knew whether it was something he wrote, something else that he had written, or whether it was pure imagination. But I knew that whatever he did would happen only one time. So I relaxed each precious second and did exactly what I knew the poem would tell me to do. I knew that others could experience the message of these beautiful poems, which sounded so spontaneous, but which were so beautifully crafted, capturing the essence of his experiences in Mexico. Whether you were there that night to hear him read them in his magnificent natural style, or whether you read them in the silence of your room, which I did many times since that night, they always rang true. I understand why so many poets held Jack in such high esteem. Gregory left. Rocco pulled out another joint, and Alan read some more. You cats are crazy, said Buddy. I could have been a singer. I dig show business, but I don't want nobody in my life to answer to except my own self. This is my King Kong weed, said Rocco, pulling out a joint that was wrapped inside a shredded Philly's cigar. After you smoke this, you'll be able to climb the Empire State Building like King Kong did and pull down planes from the air with your bare hands. Let's check it out, said Buddy. I'm all for that. We passed around the joint and all began coughing violently. Alan lurched over to his icebox and took out a large bottle of prune juice, which we all drank, since there was no more wine left. Jack and I began making up rhymed verses on the spot about everybody in the room and our shared experiences together. Buddy the wino joined in, throwing out lines as if we had all played and rapped together for years. Rocco and Alan took the saucepan Gregory had been drinking out of and the prune juice bottle and used them to play percussion parts, tapping on them with some old, greasy, unwashed chopsticks that Alan grabbed from the fetid waters of his half-filled kitchen sink. At 4 a.m., we trudged out of Alan's to go back to my 6th Avenue apartment where Jack was crashing. We said goodbye to Buddy and to Rocco. Let's do this again soon, fellas, said Rocco. Come by and see me. If I'm not in my office in Washington Square Park, I'll be around here. I'm getting some killer weed and some uppers from an old Army buddy who just got out of the slammer and is coming to New York. I'll save you some samples and we'll have ourselves a party. It was a ball, said Buddy. Stay beautiful. Give me $2 more for some waffles for breakfast, and I'll pray for both of you. We gave Buddy everything we had left in our pockets and walked towards my apartment in the amazingly peaceful 4:15 a.m. New York late night, early morning calm. If we hadn't met Buddy, I don't know if I ever would have read Mexico City Blues aloud, said Jack. Guys like that have so much knowledge of life and a spirituality that they must have acquired because of all they've been through. Dostoevsky wrote about salvation through suffering. The penitentes who participate in Mexican street events are like Buddy and Rocco. They rise to another level through their suffering as if they are hearing their own personal cross and bearing it for all of us. I can't help seeing things this way. You seem to have instinctive empathy for the Catholic Church, Davy, even if you don't understand it. Maybe it's because you love still being Jewish. Alan doesn't get it. He tries to equate spirituality with politics. Our feelings of divinity and man's pain and searching for either Jesus or nirvana have nothing to do with some miserable European sociological intellectual approach towards finding God. All anyone cares about in New York is knowing who deserves the most money and who should wear the crown Jesus had 40 years ago. But it was the crown of thorns. Your Moses spent 40 years in the desert looking for a drink of water. Ah, Davy, life is cruel, but also a joy. I'm hungry, man. That prune juice and King Kong weed gave me an appetite. Make me one of your amazing omelets where you empty out the icebox and fry up everything in an Amramian church and temple melange of spontaneously chosen ingredients, like a Mahler symphony concocted on the spot with extra grease. Quebec's cuisine has given me a cast iron stomach. I can't play football anymore, but I can still eat one of your omelets. I opened up the old icebox and took out everything: Swiss cheese, yogurt, onions, peanut butter, pickles, radishes, moldy baked beans, garlic powder, a half open can of clam chowder, gefilte fish, creamed herring, 9 eggs, threw everything in a big bowl, whipped it up into a frightening looking morass of slimy goo, and dumped it in the hot frying pan full of boiling safflower oil. I thought you were on one of your health kicks, said Jack. I am, I said. The safflower oil is organic and low fat. Oh, I see, said Jack, in a basso profundo voice, suddenly taking on the role of a federal judge or a brain surgeon. Do you have scientific evidence to support your recipe's nutritional value? Have you documented the number of fatalities in the past decade from your patients who have ingested this concoction? Not yet, Jack, I said, but this will be my latest, greatest, tastiest, nastiest, moving, and grooving survival omelet. We sat down with 2 chairs facing the icebox and began eating our omelet on plastic plates on our laps, while reaching into the icebox to sprinkle anything piled up there on top of the omelets for extra flavoring, and finished off 2 stale, half empty bottles of beer and Dr. Brown's black cherry soda. Jack's face suddenly lit up and he lurched over, reached over in the back of the icebox. Voila! He shouted. Look what the chef has hidden in his cupboard. He leaned back and held up a pair of sneakers, with the left sneaker covered with a mossy green mold sprouting plant like from a rotted piece of camembert cheese lodged next to the sneaker's heel. It's like a Corso poem, said Jack, laughing. Fried sneakers. Nah, I said. Those are Janine's. She's mad at me because I couldn't remember where she left them. When Laura came back unexpectedly to stay with me, I hid all Janine's stuff. Then Laura went back to her day job as a cook in the Merchant Marines. Janine came over and was suspicious that everything looked so orderly. You can't fool women about anything, said Jack. All you can do is be totally honest. No deceitfulness, no petite bourgeois politesse. Just be real. Your peccadillos only mean you are fulfilling your destiny as a born sinner. Jesus forgave Mary Magdalene. Janine will forgive you. We ate our omelets, and Jack talked about visions of Cody till 5 a.m. He was devastated that no one would publish it. They're ignoring me. They're saying my time is past. My time is now. My time will always be now. Just like Charlie Parker's 1945 masterpiece, Now is the Time. My time is now. Jack's face clouded over, and he gently placed the scroll of Mexico City blues back in his little bag. Ah, so much to write about, Davy. The world is hurting. Life is being squeezed out of us by greed and narcissism. Even the artists and poets are betraying our calling. God calls on us to do our work. Laborer, trucker, poet, lawyer, gangster, big fingered short omelet cook, all are answering God's call. I'm an author. He always pronounced it author after a few drinks in the musical style of Lowell, Massachusetts. I am an author. History will judge me by my work. By your works ye shall be known. That work that you put into that omelet is doing its work on me. I am slipping into the arms of Morpheus. I'll give you the bed, I said, moving a pile of music, books, and clothes off the couch, which also served as my bed and research center. Nah, said Jack. I'll take my usual literary place at the foot of the bed of the master composer, musicologist, romantic, and my own bebop and Berlioz collaborator, Monsieur le Maestro Mez McGillicuddy. That was the name later given to me by Jack in the film Pull My Daisy. Jack unrolled my sleeping bag and lay down on the linoleum floor. I've got to get up in 3 hours and make a rehearsal, I said. Dors bien, sleep well, said Jack. I'll dream of our mountain farm where someday we'll all live together with Neil Cassidy and Carolyn and their kids and your wife and kids when you finally get some. I know you've heard this before, Davy, but someday we'll do it. Look, man, look at that bird staring at us through the window. A bird had landed on the windowsill and had perched on the ledge with its head cocked back. It sat quietly and suddenly let out a high pitched tweet. Dig that, said Jack, lifting his head up from the cushion on the sleeping bag. That bird is singing to us. It's the purest music, like Messiaen's Les Oiseaux Exotiques, with all the different bird calls, like Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony in the movement after the ending of the storm, when the flute becomes the bird. Maybe it's the bird himself, Charlie Parker, coming back from his 1955 demise to tell us he's still here, visiting at us at Shea Amram, singing his sweet song to us on your sacred sill on an early New York morning in a new body, still waiting for more music to come after an all night jam session. I'll feed it some of my omelet, I said. No, Davy, no, said Jack. Please refrain. A few bites of that omelet might kill it. Okay, I said. I'll have a bite for me. Save me some, said Jack. It's powerful enough to cure any hangover. The bird sat still, cocking its head as Jack began to snore peacefully over the sounds of early morning New York City rush hour traffic. Another night had turned to day. I set my alarm to wake myself up. I had a rehearsal in a few hours and I knew I had to be there on time. I knew the time I spent with Jack was always precious, regardless of who we were with or what we did. Not a moment was ever wasted. Chapter 3, A Brief University of Hangoutology Field Trip. In January of 1959, we collaborated with a once-in-a-lifetime group of artists on the film Pull My Daisy. In addition to appearing in the film as Mez McGillicuddy, the deranged French horn player in a moth-eaten sweater, I composed the entire score for the film and wrote the music for the title song, Pull My Daisy, with lyrics by Jack, Neil Cassidy, and Allen Ginsberg. The idea of making a film based on Jack's works was easier to talk about than to actually accomplish. Many people felt that the experience of reading on the road was like watching a film projected on the screen of your mind as you devoured the pages of his classic adventure story poem novel. All of his writing, like his numerous raps, conjured up kaleidoscopic imagery that made you feel that you were a member of the cast in a great documentary film about the quintessential America we all longed to be part of. Like most of the high energy musicians, poets, painters, and assorted dreamers we hung out with, Jack relished every precious moment of each day and night. He often told me that his books were sight and sound journeys, told in the style of a great jazz solo to be shared by the readers joining him in his endless odyssey. One afternoon in the middle of November 1958, Jack came over to my sixth floor walk up apartment at 114th Christopher Street from his house on Gilbert Street in Northport. I've got an idea for a short film, Davy, a petit flick about a simple afternoon at Neil's house. It's a scene from a play I'd like to write about what we all mean to one another. Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, and Peter Orlovsky will play themselves. They are all the psychotic poets who drive Neil's wife and everyone else crazy. Larry Rivers is going to be Neil, and you can be Meds McGillicuddy, the mad French horn playing, optimistic Irish American nutcase. It will be a silent film, and I can narrate it after it's been shot while you play music for me, like the great Charlie Chaplin silent movies. We could do our part together spontaneously, like we've always done, while we're watching the final edited version. We can paint a picture. No one today knows what beat is about. They certainly have no idea what I'm about, especially if they read articles about me where I'm misquoted. They're forced to judge me by embittered journalists who gave up their dreams of writing to become slaves to heartless publication run by people who have never read a word that I've written. They neglect the fact that I'm referring to the Beatitudes and to the beat of everyone's ancestral drum that we all carry through our lives from the time we hear our mother's heartbeat before we are even born. The beatnik crap is distorting everything all of us are trying to say. It's even distorting history by cheapening the memories of Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk. In the 40s, when I heard them at Minton's in Harlem, they were wearing berets and horn rimmed glasses to show their allegiance with Picasso, Jean Paul Sartre, and the revolutionary artists because they wanted the same respect shown to them as American musical visionaries. The beatnik crap has usurped their dress style, making a joke out of their struggles. The kids today are brainwashed about this. They don't know that the bongos are linked to Africa and have religious connotations. They don't know about Afro-Cuban influences on American music, or Chano Pozo, or Machito's contributions to the history of jazz right here in New York City. They're just kids being guided by money-grubbing merchants who no longer read books or sit in Buena Vista silence, digging the sounds of the last genius pioneers of bop. Alan accuses me of being stuck in the past. I tell him I only want to see this great chapter in history I witnessed recorded. What's new comes from what's old. And if it's of lasting value, it stays new forever. Our little movie, Notre Petit Flic, can hippify these kids to the ancient happenings of a few years ago. They can see all of us, now dismissed as passe pioneers of the beat generation, as regular human beings and fellow artists, spending a silly afternoon together in a tete-a-tete until Neil's wife can't stand our mooching and freeloading anymore and throws us all out of her apartment that she, Neil, and the children can have a few family moments of tranquility. Ah, ça ne fait rien. Let's go to Washington Square Park and see if we can meet some gum chewing chess master genius and some young gals to bring up to your pad. You can cook them a Hector Berlioz style omelet of leftovers with eggs, and I'll recite to them from my latest tome. Jack and I strolled over to the park. Through the brisk November streets, I told him about my new piece for string orchestra, Autobiography for Strings, which was going to be premiered in June of 1959 by Maurice Perez at a concert at New York University, only a few blocks from where we were walking in the village. It was inspired by what we've done together combining the spontaneous and the formal. I said it's a one movement piece using the sonata allegro form with every note written out. I use a lot of jazz harmony, walking bass lines, and ideas I've made up on the spot as a player, ideas that are never used by composers in a string orchestra composition. It's not elevator music or commercial schlock schmaltz Broadway trash. I'm trying to create a piece of music based on the real thing so orchestral string players can feel that spirit of what it was like for me to play with Mingus and Clifford Brown and Sonny Rollins, Bill Evans, Dizzy, and Monk. Stick to your guns, Davy, said Jack. Do it right and follow your heart. Otherwise, the ghosts of Bartok, Gershwin, Schubert, and Charlie Parker will creep beneath your sheets like crawling cockroaches in the silence of the night and make you give penance and recite Hail Marys as they confront you in your petit chateau, sliding on the linoleum floor between symmetrical mounds of pizza crusts and tortured socks. We walked around the circle surrounding the fountain in Washington Square Park, talking to old acquaintances of ours who knew Jack from before he'd become so well known. He was always most comfortable with old acquaintances or young people who knew nothing about him, but who had a hunger for life. He loved to start a conversation so he could lay back and listen once he had started a dialogue. As we gradually strolled through the park and past some of the chess players who braved the cold weather, I told Jack the next orchestral piece I was going to write, inspired in part by some great raps by Lord Buckley, the philosopher, comedian, poet we both admired. Jack could recite some of Lord Buckley's routines based on the stories of Bible and Shakespeare and told in a street scat style all his own, with a Winston Churchill like evangelical flavor. I told Jack it was going to be scored for oboe, two horns, and strings, combining Elizabethan harmonies similar to the scores I was writing for Joe Papp's Shakespeare in the Park and the classical dramas at the Phoenix Theater, where I'd become the composer in residence. I'm calling it Shakespearean Concerto, I said. I hummed Jack some of the melodies, one of which was the song for the wind and the rain that I composed a few months ago in the summer of 1958 for a production in Central Park of Twelfth Night. 20 years later, it became the principal melody for my full-length opera Twelfth Night. When I sang it for the first time to Jack, he nodded his head. Oh man, that was nice. And it fits Shakespeare's words. C'est beau, Davy. I explained to Jack that while some of the musical materials for the new piece I was writing sounded like jazz, they would be combined with classically composed counterpoint, using jazz harmonies and occasional Latin American rhythms and other sounds of the 1950s New York City street music. I tried to demonstrate to Jack a section in the last movement where the string players gently tapped conga and bongo rhythms on the backs of their instruments, while the oboe played two written out 12-bar blues choruses. As I began to play some of the bongo and conga parts on my knee and leg with one hand and the back of an empty park bench with the other hand while singing the oboe part, Jack began to recite a spontaneous monologue in the style of Shakespeare, taking the story from Twelfth Night as one of the sea captains from Illyria running his ship aground in the storm and crash landing in Elmira, Pennsylvania, where Viola, the long lost sibling of Shakespeare's play, joined the viola section of my orchestra and sat in for the eventual premiere of my new Shakespearean concerto. Oh, I wish I'd recorded that, Jack, I said. Ça ne fait rien, said Jack. It was too corny. Anyway, it's already been recorded in the sands of time and is planted in the souls of the nearby chess players and wine drinking heroes of Washington Square Park. Now it's inscribed in their book of life. I'll remember what was worth remembering and choose tidbits of it, which will appear someday in a future oeuvre. Jack's Shakespearean recitation reminded me of Lord Buckley, as if he were an English literature professor at a faculty tea, holding up an imaginary teacup in the air with his little finger extended. Jack was an exceptionally gifted mimic, able to portray several characters at the same time, all having an imaginary conversation with one another. We walked back to the circle by the fountain in Washington Square Park and participated in an informal jam session with some folk guitar players, Latin percussionists, and a West Indian street drummer, street musician, who also played a suitcase full of percussion instruments and passed an empty cigar box for donations at the end of each performance. I played my French horn and wooden flutes, and Jack played on a set of bongos that the steel drummer handed him. Hey, man, you're that writer I see sometimes on television. That's right, said Jack. You're a bad cat, man. I read The Subterraneans. Write a book about me. I got some bad stories. He spent a half an hour telling Jack and a group of us who gathered around him of his tales of his childhood in the West Indies. He described how steel drums were built, what they meant to the West Indians, how the British had failed in brainwashing the West Indians when they tried to make them forget their African heritage and the beauty of the islands and the unique qualities of each island. Jack was spellbound, listening intently, nodding his head as if he were the part of every story being told. Again, Jack was that one person Charles Mingus had told me about that everyone needed in life to communicate with. Finally, the steel drummer came up into the home stretch of a tall tale about a giant fish that would come up to the side of his small sailing dinghy and lie in the water next to his boat when he brought out a small steel drum aboard to serenade the huge fish in the sunset. That fish loved to hear me play. He would have followed me on shore and flapped his way back to my home if he'd been able to. Well, I got to make me some money now. He began playing after opening up his cigar box for donations. Jack and I put what we had into the box. The Cafe Figaro always gave us free food and coffee. Don't forget to write a book about me, he said to Jack before launching into a calypso standard. These are the great poets and novelists, said Jack as the drummer finished the song. No one can ever capture the beauty of their poetry or the perfect structure of their stories. Guys like him remind me of why I wanted to be a writer. We never met the gal of my dreams that night or got to talk to the gum chewing genius chess players that Jack had hoped we would meet. Instead of going to the Figaro, we walked over to the Five Spot so I could sit in a set with a band that was playing there. Joe Termini, the owner of the original Five Spot since Cecil Taylor and I had played there in 1956, greeted us warmly. Jack, Dave, come on in. Come to the kitchen. I'll make you some hamburgers with fried onions and mayonnaise on an English muffin. I remember that's what you guys liked. You guys never come around anymore. I'm away a lot, said Jack. I'm home writing music, I said sheepishly. Remember this, said Joe, proudly pointing to the wall. There was an issue of Esquire magazine with a feature article entitled Upper and Lower Bohemia. There was a huge two-page color picture of me playing with my quartet taken in January of 1957 and published in the July 1957 issue. Below the photo was printed the caption which described the Five Spot at that time. It said, Dave Amram leads his jazz group at the Five Spot crowd at about midnight. In quieter moments, a poet will sometimes read his verse to the music. That was you they were writing about, Jack, said Joe. Reading there with Dave in early 1957, before you got famous. Reading there with Dave. You guys did the first jazz poetry reading in New York at the Brady Gallery. I was just hanging out that winter. That was you, Jack. You and Dave and Cecil Taylor helped to make the 5 spot. Me and many others, said Jack softly. I miss you guys, said Joe Termody. Oh boy, what times we had. All the artists, all those crazy people. The old crowd doesn't come here anymore. We're doing great. We've got headliners playing here now. I had to raise my prices. Tourists come from all over the world to see the 5 spot. We're opening up a new club on St. Mark's Place. After 30 years in the bar business, I'm finally making some money. How's Larry Rivers, Alfred Leslie, Robert Frank, all the old gang? We're about to make a movie together a few blocks from here, said Jack. I'll come see it, said Joe. I'll tell all my friends. You guys put us on the map. Take some apple pie if you want. Wine, beer, whatever you want. On the house. I've got to take care of these customers. Joe went out into the packed house, and Jack and I sat in the kitchen and talked to Dennis Charles, the drummer who had played with Cecil Taylor at the end of 1956 and with my quartet for 11 weeks at the beginning of 1957. Man, I see you out there now, Jack. I remember seeing you in early 57 when we played here. You were usually the only cat listening. You sounded good when you read with us, too. You're out here now. I see people carrying your books now all around. I hope they read them, said Jack. Dennis laughed. I do. You read about it like it really is. We began talking about astrology, life in outer space, and John Coltrane's fascination with Albert Einstein. We also demolished a whole apple pie, a rack of hamburgers, and 2 pitchers of beer. None of us were what we now call health conscious in those days. We took it for granted that we were indestructible and would live forever. And when we finally got home, Jack collapsed on my couch, and I worked on autobiography for strings until dawn. Jack left New York the next day for one of his journeys. And next week, we will read Spontaneous Commotion, The Making of Pull My Daisy. But for now, we're delighted to have our featured guest, Mr. Bill Morgan, who's just so incredible. And of course, joined by a guest every week, the other 2 weeks that we did the program, Jim Canary, the person who's the conservator of the original scroll for On the Road, and also the wonderful, wonderful visual artist who makes all of us inspired by his spontaneity, Mr. Norton Wisdom. And again, to thank Pamela Dickerson, who thought of doing all of this, and the wonderful Anthony Desmabier, who is such a terrific technical genius in addition to being a musician, singer, composer, and improviser himself. But before we have our great guests come, we have a very special treat of being able to see Lawrence Ferlinghetti, accompanied by me, spontaneously making a whole CD of his music with poetry, or my music and his poetry, or his poetry and my music would be a better way of saying it, done in one 3-hour session, which included lunch in 1994 at Zoetrope Studios, which Francis Ford Coppola was gracious enough to let us use and provide an engineer so we could make an off-the-cuff recording. And all these years later, there's also a video, and it's being shown probably for the first time. So for all the young people who were out there, we encourage you to join with your friends to celebrate spontaneity and formality and to work hard, as Bill Morgan, you'll see, has done with the 40 books he's written, and as Jim Canary has done all of his life, as Norton Wisdom has done, and as all of us can do to make our work and our life a joy and try to contribute something to others.
I think it's going to be about 10 minutes for intermission, maybe 8
Okay.
to 10.
Number 4. In Paris, in a loud, dark winter, when the sun was something in Provence, when I came upon the poetry of again, in the summer of Sauterelle, its fountains full of petals, and its river thrown down through all the burnt places of that almond world, and the fields full of silence, though the crickets sang with their legs. And in the poet's plangent dream I saw no Lorelei upon the Rhone, nor angels debarked at Marseille, but couples going nude into the sad water, in the profound lasciviousness of spring, in an algebra of lyricism, which I am still deciphering. Number 5. Not too long after the beginning of time, upon a 9 o'clock of a not-too-hot summer night, standing in the door of the new Pisa, under the forgotten plaster head of Dante, waiting for a table and watching everything, was a man with a mirror for a head, which didn't look so abnormal at that, except that real ears stuck out, and he had a sign which read, "A poem is a mirror walking down a strange street." But anyway, as I was saying, not too long after the beginning of time, this man, who was all eyes, had no mouth, and all he could do was show people what he meant, and it turned out he claimed to be a painter. But anyway, this painter, who couldn't talk or tell anything about what he meant, looked like just about the happiest painter in all the world, standing there taking it all in and reflecting everything in his great big hungry eye. But anyways, so it was I saw reflected there 4 walls covered with pictures of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, all of them leaning in different directions, 5 booths with tables, 15 tables without booths, 1 bar with 1 bartender looking like a baseball champ with a lot of neighborhood trophies hung up behind, 3 waitresses of various sizes and faces, 1 as big as a little fox terrier, 1 as large as a small sperm whale, 1 as strange as an angel, but all 3 with the same eyes, 1 kitchen door with 1 brother cook standing in it with the same eyes, and about 163 people all talking and waving and laughing and eating and drinking and smiling and frowning and shaking heads and opening mouths and putting forks and spoons in them and chewing and swallowing all kinds of produce and sitting back and relaxing maybe and drinking coffee and lighting cigarettes and getting up and so on and so off into the night without ever noticing the man with the mirror head below the forgotten plaster head of Dante, looking down at everyone with the same eyes, as if he were still searching everywhere for his lost Beatrice, but with just a touch of devilish lipstick on the very tip of his nose. Number 6. And the Arabs asked terrible questions, and the Pope didn't know what to say, and the people ran around in wooden shoes asking which way was the head of Midas facing, and everyone said no instead of yes, while still forever in the Luxembourg Gardens, in the fountains of the Medici, were their fat red goldfish and the fat white goldfish, and the children running around the pool, pointing and piping, "Des poissons rouges! Des poissons rouges!" But they ran off, and a leaf unhooked itself and fell upon the pool and lay like an eye, winking circles. And then the pool was very still, and there was a dog just standing there at the edge of the pool, looking down at the tranced fish, and not barking or waving its funny tail or anything, so that For a moment then, in the late November dusk, silence hung like a lost idea, and a statue turned its head. Okay, number 7 is easy. Something New Yorkish.
Yeah, that's where we could put some of the jazz chords in, but that we haven't had that
Yeah,
yet.
Sunday in Central Park.
For the, yes. That's right.
He's ripping off everybody. J.S. Bach, Thelonious Monk.
Boy. Okay.
Number 7. Yes, and we stood about up in Central Park, dropping coins in the fountains, and a harlequin came naked among the nursemaids and caught them picking their noses when they should have been dancing. Number 8. Sorolia's women, in their picture hats, stretched upon his canvas beaches, beguiled the Spanish Impressionists. And were they fraudulent pictures of the world, the way the light played on them, creating illusions of love? I cannot help but think that their reality was almost as real as my memory of today. When the last sun hung on the hills, and I heard the day falling like the gulls that fell almost to land, while the last picnickers lay and loved in the blowing yellow broom, resisted and resisting, tearing themselves apart again, until the last hot hung climax, which could at last no longer be resisted, made them moan. And night's trees stood up. Number 9. Truth is not the secret of a few, yet you would maybe think so the way some librarians and cultural ambassadors and especially museum directors act. You'd think they had a corner on it the way they walk around shaking their high heads and looking as if they never went to the bathroom or anything. But I wouldn't blame them if I were you. They say the spiritual is best conceived in abstract terms. And then, too, walking around in museums always makes me want to sit down. I always feel so constipated in those high altitudes. Number 10. I think think it's too fast.
Okay.
This is a little creaky old wooden train going through the countryside. That's better.
Okay, good.
Number 10. For all I know, maybe she was happier than anyone. That lone crone in the shawl on the orange crate train, with a little tame bird in her handkerchief, crooning to it all the time, Mia mascotta, mia mascotta. And none of the Sunday excursionists with their bottles and their baskets paying any attention, and the coach creaking on through cornfields so slowly that butterflies blew in and out. Number 11. Fortune has its cookies to give out, which is a good thing, since it's been a long time since that summer in Brooklyn, when they closed off the street one hot day, and the firemen turned on their hoses, and all the kids ran out in it, in the middle of the street. And there were maybe a couple of dozen of us out there, with the water squirting up to the sky and all over us. And there were maybe only 6 of us kids all together, running around in our bare feet and birthday suits. And I remember Molly, but then the firemen stopped squirting their hoses all of a sudden and went back in their firehouse and started playing pinochle again, just as if nothing had ever happened. Well, I remember Molly looked at me and ran in, because I guess really we were the only ones there. Number 12. And she, like a young year, walking through the earth, in the Bois de Boulogne that time. Or as I remember her, stepping out of a bathtub in that gold flat she had, corner of Boulevard des Italiens. Oh, they say she tried everything before the end. Took up television and crosswords, even crocheting and things like that, and came to have the air before the end, as her favorite poet described her, of always carrying flowers towards some far abandoned tomb, which doesn't surprise me now that I come to think of it. The struck seed was in her. Number 13. It was a face which darkness could kill in an instant. A face as easily hurt by laughter or light. We think differently at night, she told me once, lying back languidly. And she would quote Cocteau. I feel there is an angel in me, she'd say, whom I am constantly shocking. Then she would smile and look away, light a cigarette for me, sigh and rise and stretch her sweet anatomy, let fall a stocking. I like to do the 13 over, I think.
Okay, let's try that again.
if you could try to cut in, not in the middle of a phrase, but between phrases.
Okay.
That's, okay.
Sounds good. We are rolling.
Number 13. It was a face which darkness could kill in an instant. A face as easily hurt by laughter or light. We think differently at night, she told me once, lying back languidly. And she would quote Cocteau. I feel there is an angel in me, she'd say, whom I am constantly shocking. Then she would smile and look away, light a cigarette for me, sigh and rise and stretch her sweet anatomy. Let fall a stocking. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Nice.
That was so beautiful to see that. And I'm so glad all of you who are watching could see the great Lawrence Ferlinghetti doing it on the spot. Obviously, he didn't just start writing poetry on the spot. He's been doing that all of his life and used all of his schooling at the Sorbonne as a painter and all the hundreds of books that he read, the enormous amount that he wrote, all the things that he did in his bookstore, all the poets and people that he helped out, all the work of a real, true artist. And it was just so fortunate and beautiful to be with him. And like Jack, he was his own person that transcended all labels, all branding. And since his book, Coney Island of the Mind, sold over 1 million copies, it's the best-selling book of American poetry just about ever written. And in spite of that, he was the most warm, affable, and perfect person to hang out with, and gently could raise your IQ if you showed any interest in paying attention to what he was like. He was real down home, super for real, and super gifted. And I'm just so happy. And we also forgot to mention that it was because of Jim Sampis, Jack's Kerouac's nephew, that we were able to make this recording. And Jim did that kind of stuff for years and years. And I want to thank him for his making it possible and being such a help. Rather, it's not always that way. Pamela and Anthony are that way with this program. And now you're going to be as happy as I am to join and hear some of that wisdom by the person who knows more than any of us ever will about so much stuff, Mr. Bill Morgan, joined by James Canary, and of course, Norton Wisdom, who is sketching all this down for the future. So, Bill, welcome to the program. Thank you so much in your outrageous busy schedule for taking the time to do this.
Oh, no, thank you, David. That was a remarkable reading. And then to follow it up with you and Lawrence creating on the spot, that was a real treat. And don't talk about Lawrence in the past. It's not that he was a great guy. He's only 101 years old. He is a great guy.
Amen. And Bill, could you tell the listeners the great story that I never knew till you told Pamela and I the other night about how you met Lawrence?
Oh, well, I went to college at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1960s. And one of the people who came to that college and read poetry was Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And I didn't think too much about it, but I went to see it and I really enjoyed his poetry. Then later, a professor asked me to write a bibliography about a living poet. So I thought, well, I had just seen Lawrence reading and I decided I would put together a bibliography of his work. I worked on it for months and months, and then it was in pretty good shape and the professor wanted to publish it, and there were still some rough edges. So he suggested that I write to Lawrence in San Francisco and ask him a few questions, and then we could publish the bibliography. Well, I wrote to Lawrence, and he wrote back to me, and he said, I really don't have time to write and answer any questions, but if you want to come out to San Francisco, you can stay in my apartment. And over the kitchen table, you can ask your questions and I'll answer them, and you can look through my files. So this was in the 1960s, and you can imagine, here's a kid from Pittsburgh being invited to San Francisco to sit at the table of one of the greatest poets that I had ever heard of. So I jumped at the chance, went out and worked with Lawrence for about a week that time. And that developed into my naivete was that, oh, I could finish this up within a couple of months. Well, it took me 10 years to finish the bibliography, and it was finally published. And all during that time, I wrote to Lawrence, and he did begin to answer questions by mail, and I went to visit him about once a year. So we became great friends.
And I wanted to ask, maybe Jim could speak with you too, because I know you both worked with and for books. And when Jim had the scroll and people came up to him, I'm sure it's the same as when people come to you and ask you on your wonderful walking tours that you give, showing the history of that community, later called the Beat Generation. I think Jim, I've noticed when he takes the Jack Kerouac scroll around, he does the same thing in his own way of making people feel welcome, bringing them into the picture rather than saying, you don't know nothing about it, get out of my face. I don't mean to sound crude, but that's the unrefined way that sometimes refined people in charge treat other people who really are eager to learn. And both you and Jim Canary, and what I've observed, are so gracious to everyone who crosses your paths, and that's an admirable thing. And I could ask you, Jim,
Well,
how you got to
I
be
really
that
think
way,
it
or how
brings,
Bill got to be that way, but the fact that you are, I guess, is the answer.
I think it's one thing I really love, Bill, is the way you've made these collections of letters available. I think I working in a rare book library and seeing letters and diaries, you just get so close to these people and understand the relationships so much better when you have a chance to read the original sources like that. And so I'm just thrilled that you've published so many of those letters.
yeah, I think once you've read the works of these writers, then you want to know more about them. And there's nothing that's more revealing of the Beat Generation writers than their letters. They wrote letters every day. I really believe that every day they wrote 5, 6, 7 letters. I know Alan received letters and wrote letters constantly, not just when he was traveling, but when he was home. And inside those letters, they poured out their souls and their ideas. They really developed a lot of the material for the poems or the books that they wrote in those letters. You can see especially Kerouac and Ginsberg writing back and forth, developing this system of writing and talking about their plans for writing. And so I think having those available after you've read some of their work
Right.
Really is very enlightening. It's kind of interesting too, I found that as time went by, these enormous, long, important letters sort of faded away. And today I would blame this on the internet, with emails and texting. But you know what really put an end to them, Alan pointed out to me, was that long distance phone calls became inexpensive. And so they didn't have to write everything in a letter. And when they had something that was urgent or really important, they could pick up the phone and afford to call somebody in San Francisco or even overseas. And you can see that as time went by, that's what happened. The telephone replaced letters.
And a lot of that information is lost to us. And it's interesting.
Yeah, most of it is.
Yeah.
Allen Ginsberg did tape telephone conversations. But in fact, the telephone conversations don't replace those kind of letters where they thought about them and looked back on them and rewrote and corrected and really spoke and said what they wanted to say without, when you do that on the telephone, you sometimes just lose track of the theme of a letter. Now, Jim, I was always jealous of you. My wife and I went to Rome one time, and we decided that we would go and look at the scroll that was in Rome on exhibit. And I couldn't believe that someone had the job to take this scroll around and then talk to people about On the Road and Kerouac, and also enjoy the entire world. You must have gone to 20 or 30 different cities doing that.
Yeah,
What a great gig.
it was great. Yeah, and Rome was interesting. It was supposed to be part of an exhibition on the history of rock and roll, and they were working at a large museum, and the roof collapsed. There was too much weight the construction people had put on the roof. It collapsed in the gallery, so the mayor scrambled. They found this other small venue for it, which was really very intimate, I thought. And so it was there just by itself. So it was basically just the scroll and a few photographs with it. But I thought it was really a wonderful, really concise exhibit focusing just on the scroll.
Oh, I didn't know that that was originally going to be part of a larger exhibit.
Yeah, yeah. And the mayor turned out to have been a huge Kerouac fan. And what they did at the time was the publisher brought cartons full of books of On the Road in Italian, and they had these red pillows all over the floor, and they started reading. Different celebrities started reading. It was an all-night marathon reading of On the Road, which that was kind of a first for me. But everywhere it went, there were these happenings that occurred around it, which were really fun.
That's, yeah, in Europe in particular, I always go in bookstores and I look up all of the beat writers to see what is translated. And On the Road is translated everywhere and available in every bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
We're having
Looks like we have some photos here that Bill sent us. You see the screen. These are some of Bill's book covers.
There's Lawrence on trial for publishing Howl. This is the cover of the letters between Jack and Alan. That's my favorite picture of Alan sitting on a mountain. Oh, celebrity endorsement there.
The letters.
Thank you, Anthony. May I ask you, Bill, how did you begin working with Allen Ginsberg?
Well, during the course of working with Lawrence Ferlinghetti on his bibliography, I needed to find some pretty obscure, mostly magazines, but publications, and like Beatitude magazine that they had mimeographed in the 1950s. Nobody had copies of these, except that Lawrence was confident that Allen would have a copy because Allen saved everything throughout his life. He had his report cards from when he was a little kid. He had collected newspaper clippings of World War II. He collected his beard clippings. He saved those, everything that every receipt that he ever had. So Lawrence thought that Allen probably had these ones that no library had. And sure enough, I wrote to Allen and he said, come over and look through the files. And of course he had exactly what we needed. And by that time I had moved to New York City and was living around the corner from Allen. And he had all of these papers, but they were in terrible order. You know, he's a poet, he wasn't a librarian. And so I started helping him by putting things in order and getting his papers organized. And a lot of them had been on deposit at Columbia University. So I went up there and worked on it. And so in the course of that, I started working on a bibliography, whereas Lawrence's bibliography took 10 years. Alan's bibliography took me 16 years to finish. And that, as Jim Canary knows, those kind of bibliographies aren't being done anymore because, again, it's something that you can't do with the internet. You can't really determine when something is first published anymore. Publication doesn't mean as much when there's publication on demand and a lot of modern techniques that get the information out quickly, but there's no way of tracing how many copies or when they were published in the same way. But that was it. And then through Alan, through working with him, Alan was the great introducer, as David could tell you. He would introduce you to everyone that he ever met or knew. And he had a huge Rolodex at that time where he would match people up. So once I worked on his archive, he told all of his friends, including David Amram, about my work. And then I've worked with, I think, almost every beat writer since working with Alan.
How long did it take you to do this extraordinary book of letters with Kerouac and Ginsberg and all the approvals? It seems it was quite challenging to even read those letters, much less kind of translate them.
Well, the real challenge with Alan was reading his handwriting because he had very bad handwriting. So transcribing the letters took quite a bit of time. I'd say probably that book took maybe 3 years or so. David Stanford helped with the Kerouac letters, and he had already had, and Kerouac was a great typist, so most of his letters were typed. So he already had a collection of those, and then we combined them and we sifted out some that were repetitious, but it's really, as you can see, it's an enormous book for letters that just took place over maybe a 10-year period.
One of the wonderful things about the internet is that you can, and we right now can, share information that was impossible, not only in writing, but in music and art and philosophy and in human relationships. Unless you were around at 4:30 in the morning, lucky enough to be there, it passed by. I still treasure little letters that I have. That one from Jack typed and one what he wrote in hand with a little musical thing. But I'm able to copy those. But now it's possible to go on the internet and YouTube and see and be part of something that has been buried under a rock. And secondly, for all the young readers, poets, dreamers, people who want to be airline pilots, lawyers, whatever you want to do, just to be able to meet Jim Canary and also Bill Morgan and see some of the wonderful artwork of Norton Wisdom, and know that the people like Pamela who are here, and James, the amazing, and I always have trouble pronouncing his name the English way, Anthony Desmarbier, because those are the kind of people that can open up your mind and your heart to realizing that you can do something while you're here, that everyone has a story. And I just wanted to say that both Jack and Lawrence were great in terms of making people feel they were worthy and making everyone aware that we all have a story, we all have a heritage, we all have a legacy, we all have histories, we can all do something. And next week when we show Pull My Daisy, Jack would be the first one, if he were able to come back, although he never really left, to say you with an iPhone, you can make your own film. And people are doing that. All you need is a typewriter, as Jack had before they had word processors, and you can write a book that'll change the world. And you can do what Jim Canary does and help to preserve what is beautiful and encourage other people to be creative. That's never happened before. And they never, ever in my short lifetime, I'll only be 90 this November, so I'm still a work in progress. They never had a program like this when I was going to school. And this kind of programming is happening on the internet and on all over the place. And it's taking us all to school, not just the young folks, but even older, I wouldn't say old, but older folks like myself get educated every day. And that's a terrific thing. So while we miss the beauty of individual letter writing and some of the more warm humanistic things that occurred, this horrible catastrophe that we're going through now means a lot of performing is being done online. And while it's certainly not the same thing as being with another person, it gives a lot of younger people who feel that they're under a rock a chance to show what they can do and find at least one person to receive what they feel like doing and realize that we're all creative until we're talked out of it. And just having you and Jim Canary and Norton on the program is a special.
Norton's MIA. I don't know where Norton is. David, may I ask you and Bill a question, please? Which is, Bill has done these extraordinary books. I want to say Mr. Morgan, The Beats Abroad, and these walking tours in San Francisco. And you said even Lawrence Ferlinghetti didn't realize how many places there were. You also have one of New York. And in Offbeat, David talks about so many of these, like the 5 spot or the different beat spots. What could you gentlemen speak about that's in your book of New York and David's, where you played and all those things? Some of your favorite New York spots.
I thought I knew something about that till I read Bill's books, and I said, wow, I never realized some of the places that I was at. And Bill, I remember when you took the walking tour, one of your many walking tours, you had some people come by my place, and they even had a group outside that was anti-beat, anti-Kerouac, anti-everything. And you invited them, and they all came up to my place, and we even changed them around where they couldn't hate us anymore because they realized we were all pretty much in the same place.
There's Norton.
Remember that, Bill, when you came by with all those people?
Yes, it was during one of the NYU Beat Generation conferences, and we decided that we would take groups of people, maybe 20 people at a time, around Greenwich Village to show some of the sites in that immediate area around NYU. So we went over, and I was pointing out David Amram's apartment on 6th Avenue, and David puts his head out the window and says, "Come on up." So 20 unknown people trudged up to his apartment, and he hosted us, and I don't think anyone wanted to leave. They didn't want to see any more sites. They met a real honest Beat Generation composer.
Well, everybody that I knew that I wrote about in my book, and you two guys certainly all share that thing of not being selfish, nasty, greedy, narcissistic. That's a way of being, but there are enough people, and I tell young people that's already an overcrowded field in a non-growth industry. We were the recipients of graciousness and encouragement. As long as you could say please and thank you and be respectful and show some interest, you were welcomed. You didn't have to bring a big portfolio of credentials to show how important you were. It wasn't about that. And that's the human way. And that's the way most people in the world are. And if you're blessed to play music and travel around the world, you see that's every society that's still there celebrates what was and what is because of what was and what it will be because of that beautiful connection. When Charlie Parker said, now's the time, he was referring to the sanctity of the now. Jack did that. And this is really some important stuff. So the branding of the Beat Generation as a way of dismissing everybody as being a stoned out moron, was a convenient way to sell products for 2 months until it fell out of fashion. But art, music, society don't have anything to do with fashion. Today's fashion is usually in tomorrow's landfill. But the great bebop poet of the 19th century, jolly old England's John Keats, said a thing of beauty is a joy forever. And he got that right.
Yeah, but no one compares to you, David, for being generous. You've given your time to everyone. It's really a treat to know you. So I think you're a unique case. Ginsberg was generous in his own way, but nobody ever has given their time to this as much as you have.
Well, I was lucky, Bill, because I was surrounded by people who were that way. So for the 97% of people whose advice to me was, go shove it, I understood they might even be right. But I thought of those 3% of the people who weren't that way, that were so terrific, that I figured, well, maybe if I try to be that way myself, I'll have a better life. And I'm still trying to be that way. But it's a conscious effort. Someone just told me, I told Pamela recently, Gary Lippman, a wonderful writer, said, we believe we all have the wolf and the dog within us. And we are responsible for feeding the wolf or feeding the dog. And you have a choice whether you want to treat that loving dog more chow, or you want to feed the rapacious wolf his oink for the evening. And probably, if I were a true Buddhist, I would feed the wolf some of those horrible omelets I made, and then it wouldn't bother anybody because it would expire. But I think it's a choice that we have, and a lot of cultures make that choice, not because you're a do-gooder or you're slumming. It's just more fun, and it makes you able to be creative. And most important, you can pay the tuition of what you were bequeathed by others smarter and better than you'll ever be. And since you can't pay them because they're not here anymore, you can pay them back by passing on what was a gift to you. It's just that simple. It's not that hard. And most people and most societies are that way. And we're not able to see that or be part of it because that's contrary to the consumer culture, which is everybody is disgusting, everybody sucks, but you could be less revolting if you'll buy this and buy that. And just like someone who's strung out on drugs, alcohol, can become strung out on self-loathing and figuring that you'll be less disgusting if you buy stuff. And certainly great to be able to pay your rent and to buy some good food and go out once in a while. But the idea that we're besieged by is, unless you really can outbuy everybody and acquire more trash and junk, you're really sort of like a loser or a failure. So that's a long-winded way of saying thank you for the compliment. But to me, it's just a way of life that I learned from so many great musicians and artists and poets and painters and everyday people. And we're all everyday people. So far, they haven't discovered Bigfoot or the man from Mars. I'm waiting to meet an extraterrestrial and Bigfoot. I keep looking, but in the meantime, we're all just folks. So I guess we just have to all see if we can do it a little better.
I'm thinking of an example of that. Those very people that you were saying were protesting at the, I think it was the town hall reading, they were protesting about everybody being a sellout. And they had dollar bills printed up with all your pictures on as you sold out. And I was thinking, they complained about Alan because he did a Gap commercial for khaki pants. And it was in all of the magazines and everything. And they were saying, here's Alan getting rich off of this. And at the very bottom of the ad, they paid him $20,000, but it was donated to the Naropa Institute, Alan's Buddhist college. Alan never saw a penny of that money, but yet they were accusing him of selling out and becoming a fat cat because of that. And he was just trying to help that college you keep above water.
Well, I think he helped everybody. And most of the people we knew did. Some of the people that were accused of being freeloaders or panhandlers, when they would hit it, they would take everybody out and we'd spend it up and have a good time. And it was kind of wonderful in a way to overcome miserliness as a sign of maturity and truth and wisdom.
Right. That's
But you can't force when people start preaching that stuff, as soon as they start talking about spirituality, run for your wallet, because what I call the Burger Kingization of ancient religions and New Age huckster hustlers defying beautiful ways of being for thousands of years are not where it's at. I mean, the extraordinary thing about Jack was, as you know, he was a devout Catholic as well as being a devout Buddhist. And he felt, I surmised that being a contemporary Buddhist was probably the closest you could get to the St. Francis way of existing in the modern world. He was all about generosity. And of course, he was criticized for that. And now I think people still read his books because they're saying something and they're speaking about the human heart and all the things we go through in life. And that's a wonderful thing. So I recommend to all people who are watching, especially if you're young, if you can live long enough to get to be an older person, I wouldn't say old, but older person, you can really see some of those old-fashioned things that you learn from your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents are still here. And they were there when those people, now no longer with us, were kids, because they had lasting value and they made something and they worked. And I just want to say that because that's so far from the commercialized version of like beat, man, you dig what I'm saying, which means an inarticulate moron. And all of us who worked in music had to overcome that we were just a bunch of inarticulate morons. I was told when Charles Mingus invited me to a fancy party where they said, "Oh, Mingus, you're a legend." And I saw them look at me, "Who's that skinny French horn player creep you brought with him?" But anyway, I was there and I said to the host, seeing a Renoir, I said, "My God, I lived in Paris for a year. And before that, when I went to the Phillips Art Museum when I was in college and school, working as a gym teacher in a French school, I used to go by and sit and look at that Party of the Boat by Renoir. I felt I knew him and I knew Paris before I was ever there." He looked at me and said, "I'm not interested in your opinion and art. Speak through your horn." In other words, he was telling me I had no right to even open my mouth. And in a certain way, that was probably good advice. But I believed that until other people said, "No, man, you don't have to say anything, but check this out." And once you start to become more scholarly, you can learn a whole lot, and it keeps your head straight and keeps you humble because you find there's so many people out there who know more than you'll ever know. It's good to hang out with them and pick up a little erudition.
that's right. That's right.
May I ask a simple question about preservation? So James Canary, he's working with preserving manuscripts every day at the Lilly Library. And then Bill, I'm wondering, when you handle the letters, did you have to wear gloves? Did you wash your hands? Or how did you touch these things to preserve them? The letters or any
if they were in a library, you would have to follow their recommendation. But remember, in most cases, I'm working with the poet or the writer, and they've got Lawrence is a very good example. Lawrence keeps a box next to his desk, and whatever crosses his desk, he just throws into the box. It's not arranged or anything. And he does have dogs. So there are dog biscuits, there's hair from the dogs, there are old paper towels, whatever is crossing his desk goes into that box. So when I'm pulling things out and organizing them, I'm not too worried about wearing gloves and, as if this were a William Blake manuscript or something. I'm just trying to, in most cases, flatten them out, preserve them as best I can, make sure I can keep them in something that when they get to the library will follow through. I don't know what Jim has found in some boxes that people take to him, but there have been some crazy things that I've found in boxes belonging to various poets, you know, from Drugs, Allen's hypodermic needle, and in Lawrence's case, sometimes we would send things over to the Bancroft Library at the University of California, and then Lawrence would say, "Oh, but I didn't want to give that to them. I wanted it back." And Jim, have you ever had that case, Jim? Because they would not give anything back. They would make copies, but nothing is returned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see everything. Yeah. I don't think I've seen dog biscuits yet, but that's because of your work in the front there, on the front line.
Speaking of unexpected letters, what did you all think about the Joan Anderson letter showing up while the scroll was at the Autry in California, where I met James Canary?
Bill?
What do you think, James?
Well, I thought it was very interesting. It's kind of a complicated story, actually, isn't it? So I'm looking forward to having it available before too long. Isn't it due out soon?
They're publishing it in London, and
Uh-huh.
I don't know when it will be published in the United States. There's a little bit of a controversy there,
Uh-huh.
but it should be out soon in London, and we can get copies then
Sure.
of that. But it certainly was something interesting, because this letter was believed to have been lost for decades. And I was wondering what happened myself, because people accused Allen Ginsberg of losing it. And like I said, he didn't lose anything. Things might be stolen from him, but he kept everything. So I thought that probably wasn't the case. And in fact, that's what happened. It was sent off to someone and they didn't return it. And then after that person's death, I guess it did show up, and we're kind of lucky that it did. But that'll be a pretty interesting book, I think, in itself, because for those who don't know, that letter was what influenced Jack Kerouac to change his style of writing, that turned into the On the Road scroll. So that's a crucial piece of literary history.
One of the wonderful things is we're going to have his 3 children, who are now scarcely children. They're all grandparents themselves. They're going to be on one of the future programs talking about Neil Cassidy, who wrote that, what he was like as a father and as a real person. And I'll say no more, because what they say is perfect. And they're the ones who can really say it, because they were with him. And that's one of the exciting things about this program. And one of the wonderful things that I never thought would happen in my lifetime, that anybody would even get close to that, which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to try to say something about some of these people since I was there, and part of that of what they were like. And of course, with this medium, they can speak for themselves. So we hope all of you will tell your friends. And I wanted to ask you, Pamela, could we have some of the people, which was your idea of as doing the whole program, was who were there in the Zoom audience, I think they call it, if they want to ask a question to Jim or to Bill Morgan.
Sure, let's open it up to some questions. Does anybody have a question? If you just raise your hand, and then let's see, everyone looks like they're listening. We're all listening. Maybe we could go to Norton for a minute. Hi, Anthony, while he's painting.
Yes.
Norton told me today about Berkeley. Norton, can you hear us? Hi, Norton. So at the bottom left of your screen, you can unmute yourself.
Oh.
Yeah. Unmute it again. It clicked on and then off. You just push that. It went off for a minute. There you go.
No, there I go.
Yeah.
There, well,
You're live. We hear you, Norton.
Well, like last week, I hate everything I've ever said. and I made the mistake of even saying something to you that I knew would come back and bite me in the butt. But I had the privilege of being in Berkeley in the 60s and spent a lot of time in North Beach, and I got catapulted from LA because I was going to art school called Chenard's, which was a kind of a famous art school here in LA that was started in the 30s, and my mentor, this guy John Altoon, would take me to a little cafe in Venice called the Venice West Cafe, where I started drawing and with the beatnik poets that would come through, and the jazz musicians would hang out there too. And then I migrated to Berkeley, and then across where I got to hang out at the City Lights quite a bit, and got to see a lot of great readings with Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti. And I will tell you, gentlemen, that the biggest disappointment in my life, because we were talking about, I think Bill was talking about how he likes to go to bookstores in different countries. The last time I was in Paris, and I went into Shakespeare and Company, and I said, "What's going on?" They said, "Oh, Ginsberg was here yesterday reading How," and I swear to God, I'm scarred. I have a Heidelberg scar going right across my psyche, missing him because he passed away right after that. So I'm gonna hate this conversation tonight at about 4 a.m. I'm gonna wake up and you went on, and it's Pam, it's your fault for just being so and dragging that out of me. Dave, would you like to play a few minutes and then I could do what I do with this painting? You want to pick up your horn?
And I'd love to ask you, so we can see what you're doing. That looks like Lawrence Ferlinghetti from the Zoetrope Gone World poems with David Amram. That looks like Lawrence.
Well, I don't know. I'm not going to say what it is, but I will say that every time I either read or hear a Lawrence, a poem of his, I see a monkey jumping across the page, grabbing words and pulling them off the page and shuffling to the other side. That's why there's a monkey in here, because I can't listen to Ferlinghetti or read him without the mischief of a monkey grabbing my mind. And
so we're gonna layer in here, because there was a request for Bill Morgan. David asked if Bill could read something specific, and I don't know if you've pulled that up at all, Bill, but it was something you'd written about Allen Ginsberg. If you could read that, or just pick a book and open up and you could read, Bill, and Davey could play something and Norton could go to town. How's that sound?
All right. I'll read something. David wanted me to read something about when Allen passed away that was kind of sad. And I looked at it, and it's really too long, I think. But I wanted to replace it, if you don't mind, David. This is kind of one of my favorite stories, because it kind of shows the type of person that Allen was. And so I'll just read it.
And yes, you have an instrument there to gently go with the read.
Yes.
Something, Davey. Something.
What I'll do is, if it's okay with Anthony, since we didn't rehearse this, but then I never rehearsed anything with Jack either, or with Lawrence. I'm going to sneak out of the picture and onto the piano softly. I'll be playing softly, and the reason I mention that is for all of you who are listening. When I was with Jack, and the other poets I've played with, whatever we did, we tried never to have the music step or drown out the words. And the great Billy Collins, when I did a program with him called Jazzmouth in New Hampshire, a wonderful jazz poetry festival for years, he said, usually I don't have musicians play with me because the music is already in the words without a musician playing. So your job when you're playing with a poet or reader is to try to enhance the music that's there. And remember, the two great slogans. Less is more, and when in doubt, leave it out.
Okay, and action.
All right, you're ready?
I'm just trying to adjust my high-tech stuff here so I can hear you, Bill.
Okay.
And not mess up your beautiful reading.
Oh, well, don't count on too much beauty out of
No.
this.
And if the piano's too soft, that's what it's supposed to be.
All right. Are you at the keyboard?
I'm crawling over without disrupting anything. Okay, Pops, hit it.
Ready? Well, one evening, while out buying the New York Times, Allen Ginsberg stopped to talk to a friend on the street while Peter Orlovsky went into the store. As they were chatting, a bizarre scene began to unfold on the sidewalk just a few feet away. A woman, either drunk or on bad drugs, was stretched out on the pavement, one arm being yanked by her boyfriend, who was shouting, "Come on, you damn bitch, get the hell up." The woman was ignoring him, but with her free hand, she was reaching towards a ferocious looking dog, almost, but not quite within her reach. The dog's owner was struggling to hold the canine back and on his leash and yelled, "Keep your hand away, he'll bite." Instead of pulling back from the sharp fangs of the beast, the woman began calling to it with a raspy voice, "Here, doggy, doggy, doggy." The animal snarled and strained at the leash, trying to snap at the woman, who continued calling drunkenly to it. Meanwhile, the woman's partner was struggling to get the woman onto her feet, so frustrated that he was on the verge of punching her. All this made the dog strain harder on the leash to the point where his owner could barely control him. By now, everyone was screaming, and there was nasty violence in the air. At that moment, while others on the sidewalk were beginning to move away to avoid the obvious conflict that was about to erupt, Alan walked over to the woman and held out a bag of cookies. "Would you like a fig Newton?" he asked calmly. In an instant, the tension of the situation disappeared as everyone stared at this new lunatic. The dog owner was able to yank the beast away and walked off down the street. The drunken woman looked in bewilderment at Ginsberg, who continued, "Oh, I haven't introduced myself. My name is Alan, and this is my friend David," gesturing toward the man he had been talking to. By that
Wonderful. That's a beautiful piece of work, Bill. And we got it on the first take.
I think Bill froze. I don't think he was done. I think Bill is frozen.
Oh.
Yeah. He must have a little internet gap.
Himself a fearless and spontaneous peacemaker. So that story is an example of what made Ginsberg extraordinary to me. It's an instant of him being compassionate, resourceful, and merciful. So unusual was his courage, in fact, that Norman Mailer more than once called Allen Ginsberg the bravest man in America. So I thought maybe that story would give you some idea of this compassion and thinking outside the box, as we'd say today, to diffuse a situation that really would have blown up into something else.
Yes, and you just you just touched upon something which, with you and James Canary on, we slightly mentioned last week, which is Jack Kerouac translating the Mahayana Buddhism and then giving the 100 elements of Buddhism to Allen Ginsberg and insisting that he follow them, and his book, Some of the Dharma. So how did that affect you once you met Allen Ginsberg and you could see, he had his, how would you say, his Jewish side and his benevolent Buddhism side, and his, in the 60s, flower power part of creating that, and with his music. How did that affect you, Bill?
Well, I think what I saw most was Alan was always striving to, let's say, improve himself. He had a tremendous ego, as anybody who ever met him probably knows, but he was always trying to contain it. And through his studying of Buddhism, I think he was really able to get it under control, and that in that way be more generous towards people. So teaching compassion and patience with people was really something that I learned through his example.
And how did you feel about his extraordinary mind? Allen Ginsberg's recall and the amount of literature that he had read and could bring up a character or a phrase at any moment.
Yeah, in your life, you know, you meet a few geniuses, and I believe I've met two. One was Allen Ginsberg, and the other one was Oliver Sacks. And I was lucky to work with those people, but they were certainly both geniuses who their just knowledge was encyclopedic. You could, no matter what they were doing, you could be sure that they knew much more about it than you would ever know. So I think Alan's real genius was in, and maybe Oliver's as well, was in making something that was difficult to understand easier for all of us to understand.
And how did you feel about what happened with Howell and the trial and what Lawrence Ferlinghetti went through, and Allen Ginsberg having been in Europe at the time?
Yeah, I think people forget that Allen Ginsberg wasn't put on trial for obscenity. It was Lawrence Ferlinghetti who was put on trial for publishing the obscenity of Howell. And to me, I mean, I came on the scene 10 years later. It just seemed very silly that they were worrying about this poem affecting all of the youth of America. And in bringing it to trial, they made it a bestseller. That's what the censors always end up doing. They call attention to something that they hate so much. And in this case, it was a great work of art that everybody then had to read to find out what was so terrible about this. Allen always considered it a political poem, and he thought that it was the politics. It didn't have anything to do with obscenity. It was the politics that got them so upset about it. But I always felt sorry for Lawrence because he was really the hero of this, went to trial. It was eventually thrown out of court. It wasn't obscene, but he was the one who risked everything. Like you said, Allen was overseas. He never even knew what was going on until it actually was, the case was almost over.
I read the interesting thing that the judge said at the end. I'm not sure if it's in the film, but when he said, oni soit qui mal y pense, it's something to the effect of, if you are a person that thinks it's bad, then perhaps it's you and not the thing. And then I heard this is some kind of a British expression, but he actually said something, the judge said something in French, knowing, I guess, that Allen Ginsberg was in Paris at the time, that was an elevated jurisdiction.
Yeah, this was Judge Julius Hoffman, who really ruled and used the phrase that it had redeeming social value. And that then set a precedent. And Julius Hoffman was also the person who, 15 years later, presided over the trial of the Chicago 7. So quite a coincidence that Allen was involved in that trial and his work was involved in the first trial. And Julius Hoffman was a very devout, kind of born again, we'd say today, Christian, but he was fair and open-minded, and he judged it in both cases on the merits of the case. So he was, in a way, they were very lucky to have him as the judge.
Someone has crickets.
There's something else to remember about Alan too, that when Norman Mailer said he was very brave, Alan himself stopped possibly people from getting killed by confronting a group of Hell's Angels who were ready to rumble and beat up somebody. And they were so shocked that this smallish person with heavy glasses was saying, please don't be violent, because these people that you want to kill are really just like you, members of the human planet. And he was able to do that so effectively that he stopped people from getting murdered. And constantly he was helping out. I remember when Ramsey Clark ran for for president, he and I were the Greenwich Village artists in support. No one would help out Ramsey Clark because they figured he didn't have a chance, and they couldn't get any press from representing somebody like that. And Alan said, no, he's a good man. And I felt the same way. And he was really a person of principle and often risked his life and his reputation in order. And of course, the famous thing, Bill, and you were there, I'm sure, when he said to his guru, you know, I've won all these awards, but I can't be taken seriously by the literary establishment. And the guru said, shave off your beard, put on a suit and a necktie. And he did that. And then he got the job at Brooklyn College, but he was so uncomfortable being something, giving the image of something he wasn't. He went back to his crazy, wonderful self at the end. But he went through so many different changes and different phases. But he was really, you said it best, Bill, when you described what he was like. Maybe you could share that with everybody, because you said it better than anybody I ever knew.
Oh, no, you'll have to clue me in. I can't remember what I.
Oh, when you were talking about him, just what you saw is what you get, that he was the same.
Oh, yes, he was 100% the person he was on stage. He was that person off stage, and he was at times cranky and irritable and loving and kind and mischievous. It was all of those things that you would see when he was performing, but he'd come off the stage and he was exactly the same person. And just interested also, and Lawrence used to say this too, he was interested in talking to a person and hearing what they had to say. And Lawrence said he was sucking out their brains, but he really had a way. It sounds like anybody can do it, but it's very hard to concentrate completely on the person you're talking to. You know, your mind drifts, you're thinking it's time for dinner, or I've got to get out of here, or Alan focused on the person he was talking to, and no matter who it was, he would get involved with them and offer them things. And like I said, with the Rolodex, he would introduce them to somebody he thought that they would be compatible with.
And Jack Kerouac was that way too. He listened. He was, as I mentioned earlier in the book, when you were playing music or whatever you did, he was the person you could psychically feel was there because they were actually listening. And when he was with other people, he would sit back and listen and observe. And one of the great tragedies, ironies in his life is that, and on the road, he wasn't the person whom he described with the notebook clumping along behind all these nutcases. He was considered to be Dean Moriarty, who of course was Neil Cassidy, whom Jack loved because he was such a far out amazing character. But Jack himself was kind of like a wonderful reporter, and Alan was too, to a large extent. And so were many of the great composers of the 19th and 20th century who put down. George Gershwin showed what New York City was like and the relationship of African-American music, when nobody even called it that, and immigrant musics, and New York City had somehow captured that, just as Mozart captured what it was like working in the court system and doing something beautiful for a bunch of creepy people who were abusive. And the saw the beauty part. And a lot of the wonderful artists all have that in common, that they're there absorbing everything and looking and searching for that beautiful part. So it's not really sucking the brains out, it's looking and devouring the beauty that surrounds us.
Right.
If we pay attention.
Isn't it interesting that so many people thought that Jack Kerouac was the Neil Cassidy character? Jim, you've probably experienced that when you've shown the scroll. People come in and they think that he is the guy who had all of these adventures, instead of he's the guy reporting on Neil Cassidy.
Right. Yeah. No, I've seen that a lot. I get that frequently. And to me, Jack is such a tender person, and as David said, a listener, but such an observer. I mean, that's what I see in that book. I mean, that's, to me, it's such a portrait of our country at the time and the people he encountered, and the sensitivity is what comes through.
I always like to tell students when they're talking about him, about the fact that all of these great on-the-road people never had driver's licenses. Kerouac never had a driver's license. Allen Ginsberg didn't have a driver's license. Gregory Corso couldn't drive. I can't believe that they all think that they were driving back and forth across the country all the time. And they really weren't. They were passengers.
Well, we have to remember too that our heroes are all live fast and die young, shoot 'em up. We admire the gangsters from Al Capone back to Billy the Kid, and the people, and Paul Bunyan, the people who could smash, bash, and shoot, kill, as being wonderful, fine, upstanding, noble people, some of whom got a bum deal, but with their rapacious behavior was admirable. And it's interesting when you study and are lucky enough to hang out with Native American people and learn their music and find the different thousands of different ways, because there were literally thousands of nations and languages and cultures of what we call Indians, which of course was what Vine Deloria Jr., who wrote God is Red, said, we don't mind being called Indians instead of Native Americans. He said, because imagine Columbus, who was lost and thought he landed in India. What do you think they call us if he thought he landed in Turkey? So all those things are kind of relevant, related, but basically the idea of paying attention to the beauty that surrounds us and celebrating that gift, that all the nature is a gift by some force, the great creator we can't even understand, whatever we want to call it. This is a gift to us, and we have to absorb and treasure that gift and share that with other people. That's got nothing to do with left or right wing politics or anything. It just has to do with a way of seeing the beauty that surrounds us. And once you get into that kind of way of headspace, a lot of your problems will go away, except for the fact that some people might not be able to accept that because they figure if you're not aggressive and nasty enough. When I went to one of the parties with Jack, after he got famous, someone came up and said, that guy's so great. How come he's talking to me? And I explained to him that he would go find the most insecure person in the room and purposefully hang out with them because he wanted to make a soul-to-soul connection with someone who felt lonelier than he did. And when I was with Sir James Galway, the great flute player, they had this huge event honoring him. I said, he invited me. I said, where is Sir James? Because he'd been knighted. He said, he's downstairs with the Irish police band playing down in the basement. He'd seen everybody. He was glad to get the award, but he felt comfortable playing with these police band members, not because he was antisocial, but because he felt it was something that made him feel good to be with people who were for real, that treated him like a human being and not like an object. That's a good thing to think about, and it's good to read their literature because that reminds us to try to act human. And if you can't, fake it, and it'll make you feel so good you'll try to be that way anyway.
That's how we got all of Hollywood, right, David? all of entertainment.
Well, no, I felt I had other things that I really dreamed of doing. So when I was told after I did The Manchurian Candidate in 1962, I could do 7 films, I said, man, I can't write that much music, orchestrate it, conduct it, choose the musicians, and really enhance the film and do a good job. When I mentioned the idea, a good job, right away, I could see it made everybody want to lose their lunch. And I surmised at that moment, as tempting as it was, as the 31-year-old living in an $85 a month apartment, to be able to become a millionaire in 1 year, I said, if I did that 5 years down the line, if I were lucky, I'd be the ghost writer for the next David Amram when they got sick of me. So I figured I'm just going to pursue my impossible career death wishes, and try to be a composer and play music and play with poets and write symphony music and play jazz and do all the things I love to do. And now as I'm about to hit 90, I encourage every young person, follow those career death wishes to the max. Because if you feel you were put here to do something, the time to do it is now. And whatever you do to pay your rent has no bearing on your value as an artist or a person. And all those people that we're talking about were all that way in their own way. And that's why I think their work has survived, because they gave something to us. They weren't just on the take.
Can I mention social relevance for a moment? Lately, I have the poem of Lawrence Ferlinghetti going in my mind all the time, Pity the Nation. And that came from a Khalil Gibran, if I'm saying that correctly, poem, and how socially relevant these magnificent poets are today, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Allen Ginsberg, and that any discord that we may have with society or politics is that their poems actually can help us through.
Amen.
Exactly right, yes.
Well,
and for all the young poets and writers out there like Anthony, hang in there, keep doing it. Remember, Moses was in the desert 40 years, so you're right on schedule.
So I know we need to go soon. Anthony, did you have those photos that Bill sent us, or did we see them already with Lawrence Ferlinghetti and his son? Did you add them all? Were they all in there together? Or?
Yeah, I believe that we already saw them all during the slideshow.
Oh, okay, great.
Mm-hmm. So David, so we're about 5 minutes over now, which is totally awesome. Norton has been, as we've been getting to see his live work evolve, has a wonderful painting that we've ended up with over here. And I was wondering if, as we did last week, you could play him off for just a couple of minutes.
Sure.
And let us ride off into the sunset.
Okay. I would play this so far on all the shows, but since we changed our carefully crafted course, thank heavens it wasn't too carefully crafted, or it would be just another nightmare in the evening, and better off to watch the network news if you really want to suffer. But this was the instrument that we had planned on playing until Pamela thought tonight it'd be better to do something which was terrific.
So and love, will you please thank our guests for tonight? And Bill Morgan, I feel like we could have much more of you. Would love to invite you to come in another day. James Canary, we're so lucky you're here, and Norton Wisdom.
I second the motion.
It's all you, David. Thank you so much.
It's all us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Tune in next week.